after we're finished. So if for some reason you do not want to be seen on screen, please keep your video muted, and then we won't out you to anybody. But that's all I have to say. And Scott, I'm going to hand this over to you. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Barbara and the John Dewey Society for, sponsoring this online panel. We're at an exciting moment when it comes to pragmatism. The John Dewey Society, of course, is a very long-standing group of academics and practitioners in the United States that are devoted to exploring the possibilities of John Dewey's thought. Now, if a lot of you know about John Dewey, but some people don't. John Dewey was a philosopher in the American Academy. He taught at various places, University of Michigan, University of Chicago, Columbia University. And he's very well known for contributions in a lot of different areas. And one of those areas, was on education. Like my education, my kids' education owes a lot to some of the techniques and some of the themes that Dewey promoted 100 years ago in the academy and taught to teachers at Columbia. So John Dewey is this awesome figure in philosophical circles in America. Now, the theme of this panel is, trying to get discussion going between people in India and people in America about, the possibilities of Dewey's philosophy and the things that it has to offer India and the things that it may grow from contact with India. So the theme of this panel is supposed to be kind of both ways. And that's why I'm thrilled to have two people on the panel from the Western circles in America that know a lot of John Dewey, and two people from circles in India that know a lot about Dewey and about Indian matters. And so we're going to start the discussion that has been going over the last few years, where India and the US can talk more about the potentials of pragmatism, about Dewey and beyond Dewey. Now, the way this panel is going to go is I'm going to, in a few minutes, pass it over to each of our participants. They will speak for about 5 to 8 minutes or something. I told them they don't have to have a formal presentation. They can if they want. But the idea is, ruminate on the question, what does Dewey's pragmatism mean for India? And that can mean what it has to give to India, what we can get in thinking about Dewey in respect to the problems and challenges of India, and what we can add to what we think about Dewey through that exercise. So there's all kinds of ways this will go. We'll see how it happens. Now, I've dropped in the chat a call for a special issue of the John Dewey Society's journal, one of its journals, Dewey Studies. It's open access online, and it has a call for paper on, John Dewey's pragmatism and India, pasts and futures. So the idea is, if you are an academic and you like writing boring academic prose or exciting academic prose, feel free to send something in to that journal in January. And I hope to continue the discussion in even greater detail in areas like that journal and other journal issues in the future. But when you think about the question, what does Dewey's pragmatism have to offer India? It's a complex question. It's a question that points to the past. What could we say that's new about the relationship of Dewey and about, pragmatism in India? It's one that points towards the future as well, because India, in many ways, is just like the United States. Narasu wrote a book back in 1907 called The Essence of Buddhism. Ambedkar loved this book, and Ambedkar republishes it in 1948. But in the early edition, I believe 1907 was the first edition, you read through this, you're going to see Narasu talking about Buddhism and quoting Professor William James and his variety of religious experiences. There's even a passage in here where Narasu talks about the 4 ways to fix belief, which, if you know about the American pragmatist tradition, you'll immediately see these as Peirce's 4 ways from his famous essay, How to Fix Beliefs. So there's all these stories out there about how American pragmatism changes and meets India, or how we can change what we do or what we think about India or America by putting pragmatism together with India. So I invite you to listen to our thinkers, to think along with our thinkers when we have discussion in a second on this Zoom panel, and to continue the discussion outside of this 1 hour event. So now I will turn the stage over to our first speaker. Let's start with Kim Diaz, because you're next on my Zoom list. Kim Diaz is a professor at El Paso Community College, and she's done a lot of work on American thought, broadly conceived in the North and South American hemisphere. And also, she's been interested in Buddhism. So I said, Kim, you have to be someone we put on this panel to push this discussion forward. So, Kim, could you share your thoughts with us in about 5 to 8 minutes or so?
Yeah, I can try. I first definitely, I'm very excited to be here. I am so thankful to Scott for putting this together and inviting me. I feel very honored. And I can definitely do let me see, share my presentation, share screen. Okay. I prepared some slides. And I hope you can see them.
It's let's see. I think it's showing up now.
You see the
Yes,
whole
there they are.
Okay, you know how it goes. I always have a hard time figuring out where to click, but um, I'm just going to actually run through them really quick. I'm not going to go in detail because we can talk about this later, right? Okay, so let's see. There it is. So I do think that pragmatism in India, I mean, there's already a history of a convergence, right? And so for me, this is what stands out, what just pops out as mutual influence um, of each other. So we, I'm not going to go into detail, right? Because there's just so much, right? So this is just the very broad strokes of Buddhism, of pragmatism, ancient Indian philosophy and religion, and pragmatism being a modern Western philosophical tradition. Core principles of Buddhism here, we all know them. Key ideas of pragmatism. We define the truth by the results, the practical consequences. Our ideas, we want to see them as instruments for problem solving. Knowledge is derived from experience. Reality is constantly changing. Rejection of absolute universal truths and emphasis on the scientific method. So I see a connection because both of these philosophies emphasize experience. Both of them reject metaphysical absolutes. Both of them focus on practical results and problem solving, adaptability and openness to change. The present and skepticism. They're both skeptics in terms of absolutes. So this is Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. He's Japanese, he's not Indian. But Buddhism, as we know, there's so many different, we can't say this is Buddhism, right? We have a variety of the way that it has developed. But the emphasis on the here and the now, and I'm drawing on William James' pragmatism, right, of radical empiricism. So I see a connection there. We can go into more detail later. Both traditions are critical of metaphysical speculation. The Buddha was known to be silent when asked about the truth about things, and pragmatists reject unfalsifiable metaphysical claims. Both traditions want just the practical results, right? And this is a parable. I am not going to read it for the sake of discussion, but the story goes that a man was shot by an arrow, or somebody was asking the Buddha, please tell me the truth, right? Like, what is real? And then the Buddha says, look, I'm not going to, because it's as if a man was shot by an arrow. And the man wanted to know before the arrow was drawn. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this story. Before the arrow is drawn and he receives help, tell me, where did the arrow come from? Was it made out of wood? Was it made out of bamboo? What tree was it made of? The poison? Tell me the sinew, the type, So before he is given help for the poison. And so the Buddha's approach was, I'm giving you a practical way to alleviate your suffering. Let's go with that rather than speculate about the source of it, right? And more beyond that. And then another one here is the experimentalism in Buddhism. So I remember I was raised Catholic, and I loved being in my Sangha because I'm a philosopher. I love asking questions. And I remember just feeling so welcomed when it came to asking questions. And this sutra was cited to me, that the Buddha said, my teachings are like gold, and they need to be tested in the fire of, people's experiences. So don't take my word for it. Try it out yourself, and then you decide. And that reminded me a lot of the pragmatism approach, right? The experimentalism. We don't know ahead of time. Let's figure it out. Let's see. Let's test it out, and then we can have something to say about it. So metaphysically, both of them share a process philosophy, a process metaphysics. And what else did I have? And that's it. I think that's it. So I don't know. I think I've probably been talking for at least 5 minutes. So I'm gonna stop sharing. And those are some thoughts that I see convergence between Buddhism and pragmatism.
Thank you, Kim. That's great. And we'll, who knows where the conversation will go after this, but yeah, you've started us on a path that involves pragmatism, being conceptually connected to Buddhism, and these are both vibrant traditions in the various continents, and it's neat to see them put side by side. Let's switch gears a touch, but we're still going to be talking about pragmatism in India, to Professor Kanchana Mahadevan. Kanchana, would you be ready to give us 5 to 8 minutes of some of your thoughts on how these two topics may converge?
Yeah,
Professor
sure.
Mahadevan is going to soon be emeriti from University of Mumbai, but she's definitely not retiring from writing and thinking about topics like American thought and Indian thought. Kanchana, take it over.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott, for your kind words. And I'm not sure about the emeriti, but I am retired now. I retired on the 31st of October. And yeah, I hope I don't retire from thinking, that which sustains me and all of us, I think. So thank you so much for inviting me to this very interesting session and giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts, which are pretty much at a very, very initial stage. So they are very early thoughts, but let me try to articulate them. I'm just trying to see how to, just give me a minute. Yeah, I got it. I'm just trying to open yeah, I got it. I opened my paper. I was thinking about Ambedkar's interest in pragmatism as an approach of reconstruction. It's a kind of a reconstruction in the same way that Richard Rorty reconstructed pragmatism. So I see a little bit of a parallel, although there is a huge difference there. The parallel is because they both pick up Rorty and Ambedkar pick up Dewey and rethink him in very specific contexts. So Rorty has this piece on pragmatism and feminism, where he speaks about feminism, how feminism can learn from pragmatism, because pragmatism does not have a grand narrative, And there is a tendency as a part of feminists to present, he was writing in 1990, present themselves as having a very big emancipatory narrative. So instead of that, they should think of themselves as just trying to change the way they describe the world. So this is a very interesting idea, which he says he picks up from Dewey, and that is valuable. However, there were other pragmatic feminists who had begun to write at the same time, and they have something slightly different to say about Dewey, about reconstructing Dewey. So I found that interesting. The so-called uh, uh, core feminist discussions of Deweyan feminism by Charlene Haddock's Siegfried, for example. So at around the same time, writing in 1991, she asks about why aren't pragmatists writing on feminist issues, and why aren't we bringing them together? And the reasons for bringing these two strands together for her are similar to Rorty, that they are not on both sides committed to a permanent picture of a permanent world or an ultimate reality or some metaphysics that is out there. And in fact, she goes one step further than Rorty to say that pragmatists also emphasize on the need to examine inherited customs and institutions, and do so from the perspective of their own experiences and the consequences that they have on our lives. So, given that both pragmatism and feminism have worldviews that are dynamic rather than static, and they both agree that the world is rather imperfect and emphasize on changing it gradually, and the change that would come through rethinking it and redescribing it. This change would also impact action in some way, and it would lead to something like an ethics of care, but not quite according to Siegfried in the sense of Gilligan, but it would be a kind of a sensitivity to the concrete relational aspect rather than what she sees as privileging the feminine. Now, this is where I think Ambedkar can come in as a pragmatic feminist who would have elements of Rorty as well as elements of Deweyan feminists, such as Siegfried. He, long before Rorty or Siegfried, develops, according to me, a feminist pragmatism or a pragmatist feminism, which is grounded in, and this is where he differs from Rorty, that there is an aspect where Dewey is very clear about critiquing stagnant oppressive customs and traditions, and that is exactly where Ambedkar matters, I think, because the critical element in pragmatism is something he emphasizes. And this has to be sensitive to context, supportive of communication as well as relational, emphasizing the relational aspect of human beings. But at the same time, this is also, he anticipates, in my opinion, pragmatist feminist ethics of care, which is questions the sexual division of labor between men and women. And it contests the idea also of care as something that is only confined to women, which the early care theorists appear to suggest. And his contribution to the whole dimension of women's equality and women's freedom needs to be brought out via the pragmatist lens. I think that would be very helpful, especially because there are two sets of scholarship that we see on Ambedkar today. On one side, Scott Stroud's Evolution of Pragmatism in India, Ajay Skaria writing about Ambedkar, Marx, and the Buddhist question. So these are works that emphasize Ambedkar's resonances with Dewey, and also bring out, as the earlier speaker has brought out, that was a very fascinating the presentation, Buddhism's relationship to pragmatism, and given Ambedkar's own conversion, that is very important. The importance of persuasion and so forth. But then there is also a rich body of work that has highlighted Ambedkar's feminism as specific to India, intersectional, questioning this hierarchy, the graded inequality between women. And this is something that has been in the this kind of literature has been growing over the years, with Sharmila Rege and Anupama Rao, Shelja Pek, Akash Singh Rathore, Sunena Arya, and so forth. So in the context of what Scott terms as the evolution of pragmatism in India, can we think of Ambedkar's feminism as an instance of pragmatist feminism, which highlights the way pragmatism developed in India through the feminist frame? And finally, very quickly, I would like to look at specifically the way Ambedkar understood the oppression of women through its linkages with caste, and how, as Sharmila Rege and Rukmini Sen Chowdhury point out, there are three dimensions at work in this kind of gender oppression: that of controlling reproduction, that of ideological control, that of regulation of sexuality. So the manner in which patriarchy operates through its connect with caste is something that Ambedkar brings out. And in this, he visibilizes the role of women in maintaining the caste structure, and simultaneously, as Chaudhary points out, he also shows us how women can annihilate caste, that there is a potential through feminism for the annihilation of caste. Because the questioning of a permanent reality, linking our action to specific contexts, judging in very, very carefully in situations by thinking beyond the compartments of social isolation that caste has brought about. And with this, he opens up an ethics of communication, and through, for instance, suggesting that one moves beyond the prohibitions that apply to caste, such as not marrying across castes and so forth, and also by recommending measures this is in the 1930s, or such for women's mobility, by arguing for women to occupy or to move and occupy, move from the private sphere to the public sphere and occupy the public spheres, and use methods that are available to them, such as birth control and so forth. And here, in his argument for birth control for women in 1938, I will end with this quote. There is a very, very poignant quote that he point that he makes. I quote him here: "If men had to bear the pangs which women have to undergo during childbirth, none of them would even consent to bear more than a single child in his life." So I see this as a way of thinking from the point of view of the other, a kind of an imaginative thought experiment of putting oneself in another's position, and how this can expand one's mind and also lead to a certain ethics of sensitivity. I think there is some amount of potential here to be worked out, unexplored territory, and I hope to explore it. And if it has been explored, then I would like to learn from those who have already written on it. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. This sounds wonderful, Kanchana, and that's one thing that I've grown to respect about Buddhism and pragmatism. They're so flexible, they will meet different contexts and different problematics and change. And feminism is one of these contexts, one of these problematics that we've got to have in the mix when it comes to pragmatism in India and feminism. Thank you so much. Let's go to our last speaker, and then we'll open it up to discussion among the panelists and with the audience. And Nikhil Adsul is a graduate researcher at IIT-Delhi. And I've first met Nikhil in person at the Dewey Center in Carbondale, Illinois, which is quite the trek from India to get there. It's a long ways from Texas as well. So, this Nikhil is a definite Deweyan. So Nikhil, would you like to speak for 5 to 8 minutes?
Yeah, thank you, Scott, and thank you all. Am I audible first? Yeah, thank you. So, welcome all of you. Thanks, Scott, for giving me this chance, and all the organizers, and also our audience. It's 10 o'clock at night in India, and you have been sitting here very patiently, and it shows that how India is interested in pragmatism and Dewey itself. So here I am at 10 o'clock and sitting with a very fantastic book I just would like to show. This is nothing but Scott's book. And Scott had gifted me this, a signed version of this. So I would be speaking on this more. So the title of the book says that the evolution of pragmatism in India, Ambedkar, Dewey, the rhetoric of reconstruction. So friends, talking from my framework of economics and politics, because I'm a trained lawyer and an economist, so I would try to look at, as Scott says, the evolution of pragmatism in India. And definitely, I can say that it was none other than Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and who also introduced India to, as Scott says, Navayana pragmatism in 1956. Yeah, Buddha was there, but if you see the writings of Buddha, Arjun Keluskar, or there was a lot of people who had worked on Buddha, but their Buddha seemed to be a little bit more theological. But Ambedkar had twisted a lot of Buddha so that he could fit him in the framework of Navayana pragmatism. So before we talk about so-called evolution of pragmatism, so I need to tell you, as Scott had already told us, that Ambedkar was born in a Dalit caste, and which is considered as an untouchable in India. In fact, if I quote Dr. Anant Teltumbade, he says that the issue of caste is more disastrous and more dangerous than race, because at least in race we can form that solidarity of whites or, let's say, blacks. But caste, as Ambedkar says, that it's an ascending scale of reverence and descending scale of contempt, wherein your worth is decided because of your birth. And then your so-called the contestation of category starts. This is, I'm borrowing from his 1916 test, which is known as Caste in India, published on 9th May 1916. So to look at evolution of pragmatism, I need to just tell, as Scott had told, that in 1913 to 1916, Ambedkar was in contact with Dewey. But we should know that to understand the evolution of pragmatism, we need to see three frameworks or three Ambedkars, which I always say. So Ambedkar as a person, when he comes in contact with Dewey, and he undergoes his own metamorphosis, to borrow that Kafkaesque term, and he himself is attracted to pragmatism. Second, when Ambedkar comes back to India and he is acting as a non-state actor. And third, when Ambedkar enters the state, so first in the Viceroy's Council, and then he becomes the labor law minister, as well as he is the drafts or chairperson of the Constituent Assembly, where he drafts the Constitution of India. This all have a trace of pragmatism. This is what I am going to trace. So if I go to post 1915, just I'm taking that date 1915. So in India, the Indian independence movement, it was dominated by so-called a moderate category, which were, again, in the words of Lord Curzon, they say that they were nothing but seditious Brahmins. So seditious Brahmins, the term Brahmins comes from Hindu category, which is again comes from, it's a very caste term, and again it's a very religious term, where again these people believe in the hierarchies of caste, which are very inhuman. And post 1915, though, we say that India comes towards, or let's say, in the extremist phase, which was dominated by people like Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, who has again met Ambedkar in Columbia University. In fact, I feel that he must have met John Dewey also, and Pal. If you read the Stanley Wolpart's text, they also tell that they were also very fanatic towards, or their ideology belonged to Hinduism a lot. So again, there was not an iota of pragmatism either in moderates also or either in extremists also. And then we have Ambedkar, who is there in Columbia University and taking lectures from John Dewey. And as Professor Scott has rightly noted in his book by quoting K.N. Kadam, and in fact, my Ambedkar also, where he says that Ambedkar could reproduce the text of John Dewey as it is. He was so mesmerized by John Dewey. So when I say that first phase of Ambedkar, the three Ambedkars, my first Ambedkar is what? My Ambedkar is in Columbia University, where he's undergoing metamorphosis. Now my Ambedkar comes back to India, and he is now entering the political realm. But to understand him, we need to see that how Ambedkar intervenes or how Ambedkar makes an intervention in politics, economics, society, psychology, or so-called the idea of religion, which is prevalent in India. So you all need to know that, friends, in India, the religion has always been, to use the words of Brian Stock, dependent upon a textual community. Okay, so your society forms or the morality of the society or so-called the ethics of society are centered around text. And in fact, in India, the texts are nothing but what your religious texts. And as I already told you, if you see Rig Veda, which is produced from 2nd century BC to 2nd century AD, the precedents, or let's say the genesis of the caste starts from there. 10th mandal of Rig Veda, where you have a Varna Vyavastha. And from Varna, we have the origin of caste. So this is how the Indian society is centered around this text. And again, as I say that, there is also a process of osmosis, where Ambedkar talks about so-called Gabriel Tarde. He uses a sociologist, Gabriel Tarde's 1902 text, and the term called as infection of imitation. So you have Christians, you have Muslims, everybody is affected or so-called infested with the caste. So caste system is being followed by all the religions, especially Hindus, because they are the majoritarian people. And there, Ambedkar so-called feels that the mode of associated living, which he again borrows from John Dewey, is missing. And this is the stage where Ambedkar tries to intervene via politics. And in this stage, we could, as Scott has rightly worked in his book on his 2-3 seminal text. One is what his so-called Caste in India, published in 1916. And second, he talks about his brilliant treatise, which is nothing but Annihilation of Caste, published on 15th May 1936. And in fact, I would like to add that in 1927, as Scott has rightly mentioned, somewhere here in the book, he says that maybe Ambedkar must have or may have borrowed the terms called liberty, equality, and fraternity from John Dewey itself. And the same words are reproduced in his 1927 speech at Mahad, where he has gone on behalf of Dalits to reclaim the human rights. This is how Ambedkar is using the principles of pragmatism in the reconstruction of society and being a non-state actor. One. Second, when we go ahead and when we see there, Ambedkar's other works, maybe States and Minorities, which is very less discussed. Second, Linguistic Reorganization of the States. They also speak a lot about his principles of reconstruction of society and where he holds that truth. So the idea of truth is again delineated here slowly and slowly. And in fact, as Scott has talked very rightly in his book, and he has used the John Dewey's Democracy and Education, wherein he talks that how Ambedkar uses the principles of rhetoric or for amelioration depending upon the audiences. And if you look at the speeches where Ambedkar is delivering, let's say Mahad Satyagraha, or Ambedkar is talking with the group of women, or Ambedkar is writing in, let's say, for example, Ranade, Gandhi and Jinnah, which Scott has also mentioned. He gives a speech in the Gokhale Institute of Economics. So Ambedkar is peculiarly addressing the audience. And again, you can also see a thing that Ambedkar is producing his antithesis via text. To counter the textual community, he's using his antithesis of text. And again, in that text, he's using the principles of pragmatism. And again, he is creatively using history. As John Dewey had talked about that, you should refer to the past, but again, only those fragments of past which can solve the problems of the present. This is how Ambedkar uses. So he uses so-called the theory of great man by Thomas Carlyle. So that is there. And then when we go ahead and we see the Ambedkar's intervention in economics also, here, John Dewey, when I was reading about him, he deems to be a democratic socialist. And again, we can guess why Ambedkar goes to London School of Economics, which is started by Sidney Webb. And again, that is a Fabian socialist school. And Ambedkar brings his idea of pragmatism via economics in India. And now, when I talk about 1942, if you see the Ambedkar's labor reforms or whatever interventions he's bringing in the labor reforms, in the terms of economics, they are all pointing toward the same framework of pragmatism and reconstruction of society. And basically, they are in the light of experience, where you can see that now I'm sitting in Bangalore. Here, 2 hours away, there is Kolar, where Ambedkar, Kolar's speech is very famous, wherein he goes inside and sees under what conditions the workers or the coal mine workers are working, because he wants to form a policy for them. This is how Ambedkar uses the so-called idea of pragmatism here. And then if I go to my third Ambedkar, so first I talked about my individual Ambedkar who was in touch with Dewey at Columbia School. Second, I talked about my non-state Ambedkar before entering the state or before joining the Viceroy's Labor Council in 1942. And third, I will talk about my Ambedkar who has been represented in the state. So when I talk about it, we can't leave none other than the so-called whatever frameworks we bring, either feminism, either Ambedkar as a pragmatist, all comes in his seminal text, which he has doctored, nothing but the Constitution of India. So here again, if you go through his Constituent Assembly speeches, especially the 1946 speech, which he delivered on 25th November, he talks about, again, the idea or basis behind the Constitution was based on the principles of organicity. So he says that it's an organic document. And if we particularly look at certain provisions of the Constitution, which Ambedkar has explicitly tailored, or Ambedkar has explicitly talked about, or he has worked explicitly, none other than Article 368. So Article 368 gives the amending power to the Constitution of India. And the beauty is that till today, now date, around 106 times, the Constitution of India has been amended. And this is why when Ambedkar talks about in Constituent Assembly, he talks that, see, I don't want to go for so-called dogmatic, or the Constitution should be dogmatic. It should always be amenable, it should always be principled, and it should always be organic, so that it stands the test of time. This is how the beauty of pragmatism Ambedkar also brought in the Constitution of India. And again, in the Constitution of India, if you read the preamble of the Constitution, there is again a talk of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which people say that he borrowed from French Revolution, but Ambedkar himself in his there's a beautiful book by Sukhdev Rao Thorat and Narendra Kumar, Ambedkar and Democracy, where they are quoted his 1942 speech, and he says that I have borrowed these principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity from Buddhism, which Scott rightly says that it's Navayana pragmatism. And in his last speech, again, I'm talking before the Constitution is adopted on 26 November 1949, he gives a speech known as Grammar of Anarchy, where he talks about that we have entered a life of contradictions, but we have to fight for social and economic democracy, which is nothing but he's mooting, or he's trying to foreground the principles of reconstruction of society. And again, when he says that liberty, equality, and fraternity all are important, but they have to be balanced. One can't achieve one goal while destroying the possibilities of other. And again, he talks about what opposition to violence. So he uses the force, but the force of energy. And this is how Ambedkar is trying to put forth his antithesis using text. So we saw 1916 text known as Caste in India. We saw his 1936 seminal text, which had to be delivered as a speech called Annihilation of Caste. I mentioned about Ranade, Gandhi, and Jinnah, and his, as Scott mentioned, 1957 posthumous publication, Buddha and his Dhamma. So he's trying to counter the dogmatic textuality of Indian society or Indian polity or Indian morality via his own textual works. And ultimately, there are two seminal works where he's posing his antithesis via reconstruction of society, which and again via text. First is Constitution of India, and second his very beautiful book known as Buddha and Dhamma, to create a new synthesis of Navayana pragmatism, to create a new synthesis of pragmatism, which he moods that India will definitely work on. So this is how I will try to finish it. So this was, again, I took this talk from a paper which I'm writing for Scott's journal. He had already given a call for the papers. I'm working on the pragmatism and Constitution of India. So how Ambedkar's pragmatism also ventures into the Constitution of India. So here I will try to pause, and I'm open to questions if anybody has. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Nikhil. Your enthusiasm, you got to leave some things for us to study too. You're covering Ambedkar and pragmatism so wonderfully. Let's open it up to the folks on the Zoom call. And again, we've laid out a variety of themes and topics. We've explored none of them in detail, but so you can pick up anything you want to talk some more about or say something about, and we'll conclude in about 15 more minutes or so. So we've got a little time for questions. Anyone on the Zoom call want to do this, or you could type it into the chat too if you don't want to speak.
Hi
Here-
everyone.
Oh,
Can
go,
I ask?
Seema. Yeah.
Seema.
Hi, hi Professor Bob. Yeah, yeah. So the question is from Professor Kanchana. Hi, Professor Kanchana. That was a very nice presentation. I was just wondering that, when we talk about Dewey and Ambedkar, they both have contributed in the discourse on education. And my question is that as a teacher, because you mentioned about Sharmila Rege's work also. So, as a teacher, how do you bring Dewey and Ambedkar while engaging with your students? That's first question. Second is, I think it becomes extremely important in the context of education because when Dewey and Ambedkar, they both are focusing on changing habits, right? And they're both focusing on the role of education in creating consciousness. So, and school as an associated way of life. So, can you talk a little bit on how do you bring Sharmila Rege in your classroom, and what sort of challenges that you face? Right.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Um, the paper that I'm working on for the volume is on feminism, but then education is also a very important area, a pedagogy. And feminist pedagogy is also very important, and also an egalitarian pedagogy, which does not have caste discrimination, particularly in the Indian context. So how can we combine all of this, the different kinds of egalitarianisms, such as the egalitarianism of um, uh, gender, or the removal of caste in the classroom? How do we achieve this? Now, one way of doing this is, I have argued earlier in a paper, that the teacher should have the capacity to be questioned, right? The capacity to listen when she's questioned or he's questioned. And this is also the whole idea of, if a student wants to talk back to you about something, which often happens in the classroom, that students have something to say that come from their own experiences. And this is experiential dimension is a very integral part of the classroom. And often when we inflict a pre-given model, which could even be a vocational model or a theoretical model on the student, but if the student can tell us that I know this better than you, because I have experienced this, and you have gone wrong in this way or this way, I think that is something one has to be open to. So it is opening up the classroom, even if it is inconvenient. And this is particularly important also to keep the public education system going in India, which has got a room for diversity, because that is the only context when underprivileged students from underprivileged castes can enter a classroom and sit in a classroom as equals. So this is also something one needs to encourage. And in a situation which is very difficult, because when we say it's a public education, it's also an education with very little funding and so forth. So within this, what kinds of experimentations in learning are possible? This is something one would have to sit with the students and explore, I think. Yeah. And so, as Sharmila Rege puts it, this is also about bringing in the third eye, as she puts it, from the Fule's point of view. The um, bringing in a dimension into education which goes beyond the typically accepted rote models.
Thank you, Kanchana. We have a question that kind of extends that for everyone, Kanchana and others, from the chat, and it's from Abba, and it's what do this is back in the chat a few, but it says, what do the panel members anticipate as the broad strokes of social, economic, political, realities in India in the coming few decades and how they see the role of pragmatism in reconstructing the education system in India. So the question is basically, what kind of good changes might happen if we start thinking about education in a democracy like India from this pragmatic perspective, the thought of Dewey on education, let's say. How about I open that up to the panelists? Anyone have any thoughts on this? Kim, I see a hand up.
Yes, thank you. And briefly, I just want to second what Professor Mahadevan mentioned about students asking the professors, the teachers, and us promoting that, because in promoting democracy, we want to promote questioning, but at least here in the US, what is, from pre-K through high school, the students are still, by and large and for the most part, being asked to respect the authority of the teachers. And they're not really taught to question or encouraged to question. When they get to college, then the dynamic does change, and then they're supposed to become critical thinkers and question and take the learning into their own hands. But it's inconsistent, right? Because if we want students to develop this sense of thinking for yourself, right? Being autonomous and thinking for yourself and being critical, then we need to encourage it from the time that they're children throughout, not expect people here in the US, right? And in many other countries too, we go cast a vote and we think that's democracy. But to take more ownership for what happens in our communities and what happens in our own lives, that has to be inculcated or promoted from the time that they're children. So I very much agree with the analysis of Professor Kanchana. Thank you.
Can I quickly just add something? Just a minute. Yeah, I totally agree with you, Kim, that here too we have the struggle, from authoritarianism, and where the teacher is a figure of authority. So that's precisely why I think teachers have a specific task of deconstructing their authoritarian impulse, which pragmatism can help in this. Reading pragmatism can help. Thank you.
Shall I just intervene?
Yeah.
Scott? Yeah,
Go
but I feel that I have been hearing this, but something is very peculiar in India, because in India, caste is also practiced in class. So it's not something that teacher is very saintly also in India. So there was a report by Indian Express in 2015 and 16. For entire long year, they carried out that report where how the students were practicing the caste while entering the schools. And these were all primary and KG students. They were there. So it's not only about a teacher, but how socialization is also happening in India. We need to think from that perspective also, because students learn caste not in their schools, but at their homes, and they bring that to their homes. And again, your teachers in India, the teachers are a reflection of caste. In fact, I studied in TIS, which is one of the most biggest social institution. And in my classroom, they taught me about manual scavenging. The teacher who taught me about manual scavenging, in front of her home, manual scavenging was happening in the campus itself. So the problem is that here theoretical foundations are there, but practicality, or let's say implementation, is not there on the ground. And again, with the students also, the same thing. It starts from home. So I think not only schools, but also there should be a social reconstruction of so-called the patriarchal family base, which India has. And family has a very big role to play in India. So there is a lot of joint system. In fact, in the nuclear families also, we are being taught caste in our homes only. So we need to think from that perspective also, how either by a non-state or state actors, how we can bring about the reconstruction of families or reconstruction of so-called household. That should also be looked into. This is what I feel also. So it's not just the classrooms, it's also our homes also. So deviant pragmatism is not just in the schools. So I think Dewey has to be brought in the homes also. That is what I also. Yeah.
Yes, I mean that's a challenge, right? Is Dewey's experience foregrounds, or Dewey's view of education foregrounds experience and experiential learning in many ways. And how do we capture in a respectful and constructive way the experience of caste? And how do we do justice to the experience of caste? Same in the US. How do we do justice to the experience of racism, in the course of educating kids away from racism, hopefully?
Absolutely.
Yeah, does anyone else want to talk on these kinds of themes or bring up another theme? This is fine. We're going to go for about another 10 minutes at most. But other themes could be brought in too.
I mean, I would just like to add there that often, I mean, definitely the home and definitely at school. In my case, it was at school where I was treated with more dignity in a way, right? Where it's like, well, okay, your point of view is valid. Let's explore that, as opposed to because that's just the way that we do things. So I think that the classroom, if we get more progressive teachers, the classroom can be the place where the student sees themselves as having more dignity than in society, and then from there take that experience of being able to deliberate about their ideas, and take that into other contexts, right? So when they're at work, when they're in the family, if in the classroom their ideas are taken seriously and encouraged, they're questioning, then hopefully they can take that same approach in other contexts.
Mm.
Can
Yeah.
I just comment? Can I just add a line to this?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So this is exactly what Fulle means by the third eye, that there is a critique that one has to bring in to the context of the classroom. And as Nikhil was saying, there is also the problem of the classroom being an isolated space. So one needs to look at the linkages between the classroom and the outside world. And this is palpable in different ways in different parts of the world. But in India, classrooms are particularly fraught with inequalities that we see in society, such as that of caste and so forth. So that is exactly where I think Fulle, Ambedkar, Dewey, they would come in because they think of the classroom space as a kind of an opening into the world, and the world as percolating into the classroom. So maybe that porousness needs to be explored. But then someone would have to initiate it. So as Kim pointed out, the teacher as a coordinator would have to initiate this, I suppose, and be sensitive to the students.
Thank you, Kanchana. This is a wonderful point, and I'm so glad you brought up Jyotirao Phule. For those on the call that don't know about Phule, Phule and his wife Savitribai Phule were early anti-caste activists that believed education was a key way to reconstruct society, especially the education of young girls. So there's so much, and that is not even, Ambedkar has barely gotten into our discussions in American circles, and Phule needs to also be there. I don't know,
Absolutely.
any other thoughts on, we could stay with education on this, whether it's from Phule, Dewey, or Ambedkar. Does anyone else have any thoughts on or questions on education?
Barbara has a
Scott,
question.
can I ask a question to the panel about the presence of the Buddhist minority? Because I think Kim sort of laid out for us in pretty compelling ways that the sense that the Buddhism is open to pragmatist kinds of thinking. But my understanding is that the population of India is more than 80% Hindu, with some a sizable Buddhist population and then little slices of folks. So what Buddhism and caste, as we talk about addressing that, are the Buddhists outside of the Hindu, outside of the caste system completely? So Buddhism, I mean, can you comment on that? Am I asking a sensible question?
Yeah, I'll let
Yeah,
some of the
yeah.
folks from India
Yes,
speak on
absolutely.
this.
Very
Ambedkar
important.
converted with masses of underprivileged caste to Buddhism precisely because it does not have a place for caste. And he has argued in his counter-revolution essay that years ago Buddhism had brought in an egalitarianism of gender, but this sort of got overthrown by the caste Hinduism coming back and exercising its hegemony. So there is, in the Indian context, I think Neo-Buddhism, as Scott and so many others, Nick has argued today, there is a tremendous potential for evolving egalitarian social relationships via Neo-Buddhism in the Indian context, because it is a Buddhism that questions and critiques inequalities. It is also a Buddhism that establishes bonds on the by understanding the human being as social. It explores relationships, the Sangha as a way of associated living, as Kim pointed out. So some of these are very important, I think, in the Indian context, especially.
Yeah, yeah. So can I add something on Professor Kanchana? Yeah, Bob. So as yeah, Scott.
Go,
yes,
go,
yes.
go,
This
go.
is a conversation.
Yeah,
Anyone could add
yeah,
anything.
yeah. So Bob, as Professor Kanchana Mahadevan had pointed out, it's all, yeah, it's there. But again, I would like to add on some things. See, in India, Buddhism is very complex. See, with Baba Saheb Ambedkar, people converted to Buddhism so as to away from the caste. But see, all people in India, caste is a very complex category. That's why Ambedkar never uses a term called caste. He uses with a plural S. So now, what
Oh,
is contemporary situation in India? Ambedkar has been relegated only to Mahar caste. The followers of Ambedkar who are Mahars, okay, they only have converted to Buddhism. Very few people from Mang, Matang, Sambhar community have converted to Buddhism. That's why, as statistics show, that Buddhism is around 3 to 4% in India. One. Second, among the Mahars also, because of the government policies flip-flops. So there is also a so-called inferiority complex, or there is a sense of frighten that if we get converted to Buddhism, technically now as Buddhist people are considered under Hindu pantheon as per the Constitution of India. If we get converted to Buddhism and if we officially declare that we are Buddhist, tomorrow if the reservations or say let's say representation is removed, so we will be removed from that. And if you see, there is also class structure in Buddhism in India. If you see, the people who are converted to Buddhism, they are elite among the Buddhists. If we say, majorly, I'm talking about that. So Buddhism in India is a very complex category. So you will see that Namo Buddhaya people will say, or they are practicing Buddhist, but on their caste certificate, you will still find out they are Hindu and Mahars. So officially they are Hindus, but non-officially in practice they are Buddhist. So here in India, it's really a very chaos. So today only Maharashtra elections have happened. That's why it all came in the background of that. And one of the grandsons of Ambedkar is fighting with his own political party. And yeah, so that's why I felt that it's very complex here. So technically you can see that as statistics show, because if you are looking from America, 3%, 4%, but there are a lot of people who practice Buddhism. But again, they are again majorly from Mahar caste. Monks, Matangs, Sambhars, and other allied castes. They are also Dalits, but they haven't converted to Buddhism yet. Yes, it's a philosophical doctrine. Yes, it's a pragmatic doctrine. Yes, it's going to help in the annihilation of caste, but still, caste still has its grip on entire India. That's why that's why there is a beautiful there's a filmmaker, Nagaraj Manjule, where he says that casteism is in the air we breathe. So in India, if we breathe caste also. So even I'm talking in 2024, caste is still there. And caste is a major issue of elections in India. Even today, the elections happen on the basis of caste only. That is how
Yeah.
complex Buddhism is all about.
Well,
Yeah,
thank
and,
you
you know,
all for helping my ignorance. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
well,
Yeah.
Barb, this is something that both sides of this conversation need to explore more in our scholarship, because Ambedkar, unlike Dewey, saw religion, like established religions to some extent, as a ameliorative measure. You know, he put a lot of weight on Buddhism to solve or resolve the caste problem, or resist it at least. You know, and Dewey, of course, wrote Common Faith, but he didn't, you know, think Christianity was the answer to industrializing America's problems with capitalism. So yeah, it's fascinating to see how they're similar in some ways and they diverge because of their context and the problems and their hopes in other ways.
Yeah.
I would
So-
like to add that it's very similar to here in the US. We just also had elections, and one of the platforms for one party was, you know, it's disguised as economics, but for me anyway, I read racism underneath, and tones of sexism and tones of racism that are right under the surface. So it's technically, you know, we had civil rights back in the 1960s. We had, but things have, here in Texas also, those liberties continue to be ratcheted down. So in terms of diversity, there's been several legislations at the state level that erode the
Especially in
advances from the
education,
1960s.
Kim.
Yes.
Especially in
Yeah.
education, as they look at the potential for curriculum, what schools are allowed to teach.
Right. And so it's very similar. So it's not the same. Caste and race are not the same, but the fact that it remains and it's right under the surface, that is similar.
Let me just throw in that Jim Garrison, before he left, kind of asked a question, and I'd like it to be part of the record. He says, Ambedkar started what might be called left-wing populism or popularism when the Dalit movement started. Is that correct? I'm not sure. If the answer is yes, does it have implications for the politics of contemporary US, the kind of politics that Kim is talking about, and also in India? Was Ambedkar trying to start or ride a left-wing populist?
Yeah.
I would say
Professor,
no. I would say
no.
no.
Definitely no.
He is a critic. He has a great, powerful critique of majoritarianism. And I think we need to read him in the context of the rising populisms all over the world. Ambedkar can speak to the issue of populism because he points out that in a genuine democracy, the minority voice has to be heard and has to exist and has to be taken seriously. You know, so, and he was also very critical of the left. So Buddha or Marx is an essay that he wrote. And Buddhism, in fact, is in many ways an improvement over Marxism. So to term him as, but then he did advocate socialist measures and so forth. So that is a very, the nomenclature would be very complex, I think, more complex than this.
Yes, Bob, I would like to add to Professor Kanchana also. See, Ambedkar had been trained in London School of Economics, which is known to be a Fabian socialist one. And second, Ambedkar, though people say that he hadn't read Marx, but there are on record documents. Recently, a book by, I just forgot the name, Geeta. So she had written a book on Ambedkar and the question of socialism in India. So there are a lot of things which seem that Ambedkar was a little bit center left, but in his writings himself, he never admits that I am left, but definitely he had read Marx a lot. In fact, he says, it's on record, he says that I have read more Marx than the Marxists. In 1925, he says that Tim Dange also, one. And second, what I always feel is that he started his 1936 Independent Labour Party, and always you need to also see that Ambedkar was in talks with, because in 1929, 1937, when the great strike, Mumbai strike happens in Bombay, where and it is the biggest strike which India has ever seen. Ambedkar participates in that. Yes, he was dealing with the question of labor, but we can't say that left-wing populism, because the idea of left itself started in 1920s. In fact, in 1890s only, when Narayan Meghaji Lokhande is writing, and again, some people come from Satyashodhak movement. Left movement is already there in India. 1920s Dange is there, and all this Kakori conspiracy is there, Meerut conspiracy is there. But Ambedkar technically didn't start left-wing populism. He was always concerned with the questions of Dalits. And yes, he takes up the question of labor, because he justifies that I'm taking the question of labor because I feel that the majority of the laborers who don't have any rights, who don't have where accountability, responsibility is not practiced, they are Dalits. That's what it takes up. But again, that idea of labor, because I always told you, Ambedkar, when we read Ambedkar, we feel that there is caste in class and there is class in caste. So he abandons that. In 1942, he goes for an explicit scheduled caste federation, which he takes it from British 1935 Government of India Act. But I told you, whenever he joins again in 1942, the Viceroy's Council also, he is made as a labor member. So Ambedkar was always engaged in the question of labor, but deeming him as a left populist or so-called, I don't know how the professor reads left, but Ambedkar definitely had a center-left thing, but putting him in so-called left category, it is injustice on them. And and again, populism, I feel very important is that Ambedkar always worked within the precedents of so-called law. And as professor had said that, and Ambedkar, that quote he borrows from Harold Lasky from his 1926 book called Grammar of Politics, where he says that it's a duty of majority to uphold and protect the rights of minorities. This is what Ambedkar tells. So this is how we need to see Ambedkar. Yeah, and absolutely. And before his death also, he was in talks with the. So there has been a relationship of love and hate between lefts and Ambedkar. But now the recent scholarship, which says that Ambedkar was also, he engages with Marx in his Buddha and Karl Marx, there is a critic. But again, Ambedkar engages with Marx in a very creative manner. So to deeming him anti-left or a critic of Marx, also I feel that it doesn't do justice on him. In the light of recent scholarship, I feel that. And again, before his death also, there are a lot of new research has come out. Ambedkar was in talk with left. In fact, after his death also, his party, Republican Party, ties up with the left party. So deeming Ambedkar as anti-left or so-called populist is not. So he was trying to create a synthesis, because his major enemy was caste. His major enemy was gender. Annihilation of gender categories will lead to annihilation of caste. What did he believe? In fact, today, left parties also take the name of Ambedkar. Recently, there have been a fantastic biography I will share with you of autobiography of Comrade R.B. More. So he is deemed to be left, but he was working with Ambedkar as his personal assistant. So, and in fact, when he says to Ambedkar, I want to join this, left party, Ambedkar says him go. And he doesn't have any antagonistic relationship with Ambedkar. Okay. He is having a very good relationship with Ambedkar. So Ambedkar always creatively engaged with the left. So looking them as thesis and antithesis is problematic. In fact, his Buddha and Karl Marx also has to be read in today's light with the new documents, because we take it on that so-called white and black. It has to be read very creatively now.
Just to clarify my stance, I have not read him or suggested that he's anti-left, but I've just said that he cannot be labeled as left. That's all.
That question, that left-wing populism was there, na? So
yeah, I agree. I agree with everything you said. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is certain is, like Dewey, Ambedkar is very complex, and we can, say very, he's this.
Yeah.
But when we put him with one, like Pragmatism, for instance, you're just capturing a subset of it or one point of his evolution. And same with Dewey. This is the thing I realize about Dewey. He's always changing, and his political allegiances and stances are very complex and nuanced. And so sometimes we have to simplify it. But yeah, you lose a little something there, and you got to realize you don't have to always lose that. You can go back. Maybe we'll conclude it here, because this has been a start, and only a start, to what is going to be an awesome discussion over the next few years. I mean, how often do we open up a new frontier? I'm speaking to those of us that are in John Dewey Society circles. How often do we open up a new frontier when it comes to the study of John Dewey? And that's what's effectively happened over the last 10 or 20 years. Folks like Eleanor Zelliot and others have kind of pointed that there's this Deweyan story there to be told about people like Ambedkar and like India. And if you look closely at Dewey, you see he was keeping tracks on people like Tilak and the Bhagavad Gita, for his whole life. So So there's so much more to say, and there's so much more to learn from our friends in India who wrestle with the same problems we wrestle with, education and democracy, but maybe not under the Deweyan flag. And so a lot to learn. I'm dropping one more time in the comments some links that I've shared before. Bimram Bedkar's works, if you're interested, all free. John Dewey's works, many of them online that are free. And then the John Dewey Society link to the special issue of Dewey Studies. And so people out there listening to this Zoom call can look into the John Dewey Society, join their email list, perhaps join the society or participate in its events if they see fit, and submit to this journal if you're into writing things. So again, we got to keep this conversation going because pragmatism and people interested in India have so much to learn from each other. I thank all the participants for their part in starting this conversation. I hope they write up some of these thoughts in a even more detailed fashion for that journal special issue. And, we all need to continue this conversation in our own ways.
Yep.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Thank
you
See
so
ya,
much.
Nikhil. See ya,
Yeah.
Kanchana,
Yeah.
Kim,
Yeah.
Seema, everyone out there.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining in.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you so
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Take care. Bye bye.
Okay, beautiful.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob.
Oh yeah. No, I'm
Yeah.
delighted that we're
Thank you.
able to
Thank you.
do
It
it.
was enlightening to see you
Bob.
here.
Hey,
Matlab,
Seema,
that
how
was-
are you?
Yeah.
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, good, good. I was pretty sick after I saw you in Illinois. I ended up with pneumonia, so I had to took
Oh.
me a while to recover, but now I'm
How are
fine.
you now?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm fine now. Yeah, yeah, it's all good. Okay, looks like
Hello,
hello? Who's that?
hello. My name is Manav. Can I talk with
Sh-
Nick?
Sure, sure. And I did add your name to our mailing list, Manav. I saw that you put that in the chat.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, so what's your question, sir?
I just want to contact with Mr. Nick.
Oh, Nikhil, you were there? Can you talk to Manav?
Nikhil,
I don't know what
yeah,
other
yeah,
conversations
Manav.
are
Hi,
going
Manav.
on, but
Yeah.
I think you are
Shall I
from
share my email
Maharashtra.
ID? Yeah, I am
Okay,
from
okay.
Maharashtra. Yeah. Yeah. Shall I share
Where?
it?
Where from Maharashtra?
Mumbai. One second, huh? I'm just
Okay,
sharing.
okay.
Nikhil 17ADSULE @gmail.com. Manu, did you get it?
Okay.
it's in
Wait.
the chat, Manav. You can get it out of the
Okay.
chat.
Yes, I got
Nikhil.
it. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Great,
Okay.
Manu. We will be in touch.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
you guys can connect offline here.
Yeah,
Stay
yeah.
in touch through
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Bob. See you
through
soon.
email. That's great. Okay,
Yeah,
you too, Nihal.
yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks everybody. I'm gonna wrap it up,
Yeah.
stop the recording, and end the conversation. It's great to have you all with us.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Bob. Bye bye.
Mhm.